Hi everyone. Today I'm going to take a brief detour from my videos I've been making on recent Criterion editions that coincide with the Barnes & Noble sale. And I'm going to go back about almost 90 years, 1934. And this is Little Man, What Now? It stars the great Margaret Sullavan, Douglas Montgomery, and directed by Frank Borzage. And like most Frank Borzage movies, it is a love story, and this is being set in the Depression. We very much feel the results of the Depression, the poverty, the loss of jobs, the food itself. They're going to have to go hungry at times. So it's the horrors of the world besetting this young married couple who, and Margaret Sullavan and Douglas Montgomery, they're about to have a baby. Now, one thing about Frank Borzage's love stories is he looks at love with a great deal of sincerity. He exalts it. It is the ultimate form of life. Our lives are redeemed by love. There's a spiritual nature to it. So when Hollywood makes love stories, this is not the typical kind of love story because of Borzage's sincerity. He really believes in this, and that being able to overcome obstacles that the world puts around his lovers is the test that it has to be endured. And we have, Borzage has Margaret Sullavan here. The first time they worked together, I think there's 3 or 4 more movies that she made with Borzage. This is only Margaret Sullavan's second movie. And he gives her a spectacular entrance. She comes, it's a rainy city, a rainy day in the city. She's wearing this hat and she appears around the corner in this kind of luminous close-up. I think that's the one word you got to use to describe Margaret Sullavan in the movie. She was luminous. Her eyes are just glowing. She has this voice, this range, this very unique voice, and she had such a great range. Oftentimes in Borzage's movies, we have in a kind of erotic intimacy. It's not just the spiritual nature. There's an erotic quality to Borzage's love stories. And Little Man, What Now? It says in the commentary that it's the last film that would be considered pre-code. There was a code, a production code in Hollywood, but it wasn't stringently applied. This was the last one where we would see the code stringently before we would see that. Although there was a couple scenes, especially of erotic intimacy, that was taken out in certain countries and states around the country. But being that it is pre-code, we have intimations of narratives, narrative lines, plot lines that you won't see much of once the code is really set in stone. So there's premarital sex, there's abortion, there's prostitution. The movie is not about any of those things. These are tangential elements of the plot that too infringe on the happiness, the well-being of this spiritual love. Now, this is a movie set in Germany, and it's based on a novel by Hans Fallada that was a big bestseller in the U.S. as well. It was translated, I think, in 1932. It was a big bestseller, set in Germany. So the emphasis on the Depression and the poverty would pass. The studios didn't like to do that too much, but it's in Germany, so it's much worse there. And we also get intimations of rallies. Of course, this is during the time of the rise of Adolf Hitler and the fascists, and there's rallies that become very rowdy, broken up by the police. But it's not necessarily Nazi rallies or communist rallies, because the communists were still around. But it's very much anti-violence. And in fact, Douglas Montgomery, in a couple scenes, in moments of anger, moments when he has true grievance, he picks up a knife and he looks at the knife in his hand and then he drops it. And later on, he picks up a rock. He has been knocked down by a police officer breaking up a rally. And he picks up a rock and he's about to throw it in and he puts it down. This is very much Frank Borzage. He was not violence, solves nothing. So again, back to the erotic intimacy that, the studios, getting back to that point, the studios didn't like to criticize the Nazis in those days. Now, Borzage went on to make several anti-Nazi films that were clearly anti-Nazi, but in 1934, they still thought they would have a German audience. In the commentary, again, it says that Little Man What Now was never released in Germany. As the author, Hans Fallada, the Nazis had cast a dubious eye on Fallada and basically drove him into a mental hospital eventually. And so the erotic intimacy here that we see in the tail end of the pre-code era, we see a scene in the woods, and Margaret Sullavan is sort of sitting on the edge of a brook with her feet in the water, and her dress is pulled up very high to show off her shapely legs. And then later on, she's in this same sequence, she's in a tree and she jumps down into Douglas Montgomery's arms and she lays on top of him in the forest. These were two of the scenes that when the film was, it was censored. Those were the two scenes, but they are indeed very erotic, and the whole ambiance of this forest and this sort of Edenic background. So as the film progresses, we see them having to constantly battle the outside forces. We get a sense of of what Borzage is often compared to Dickens, in the sense that he has very cruel characters and then he has very kind characters. So as cruel as the world can be, it's kindness that should be that should be exalted as well as love. You can find kindness in the world, and kindness is more important than any kind of it has no monetary value to it. It is who we in Borzage's view, it's who we are meant to be. We get a commentary here by Alan R. Cush and Daniel Kremer. It's one of those two people commentaries. I'm not a big fan of that. I'd rather, because they all have different ways, different paths to go, and sometimes they get a little bit lost in those paths. But it's full of information on everybody in the film. And they discussed the production code. This was also the last movie in Hollywood for many, many years that showed a couple in a king-size bed cuddling up together. So if you want to see the last one, it's a beautiful shot. But in watching in listening to the commentary and watching the movie, and Borzage's movies are really rewatchable. And especially with the commentary, not hearing the dialogue, the music, you see his fantastic staging and how he frames his actors, and the pictorial quality of his movies. They're really oftentimes like painting, and he's so in love with Margaret Sullavan. He frames her so beautiful. Now, the one element of the film that is weak is the leading man, Douglas Montgomery, who is a very stiff actor. And there's a New York Times review of from 1934, which really does express that what did she actually see in this guy? They're so different. And he doesn't have the chemistry. Now, there are moments when they do have some chemistry together, but he did not go on to a very successful long-term career. He did have a long-term career, but he was in this era in early 1930s. He was getting lead roles. Margaret Sullavan didn't make very many movies. I don't even think she made 20 movies, but and she does have that chemistry. For instance, if you're used to seeing her with Jimmy Stewart, where they all, I mean, you believe they're actually in love, and there are rumors that that they were as well. And of course, Margaret Sullavan suffered from insecurity as an actress. Frank Borzage did 1 or 2 takes. He didn't do much directing. And she got very frustrated with him. When are you going to start directing me? And he says, well, if you're not doing it right, you'll hear from me. He liked his actors to be natural. He didn't want to do a lot of rehearsing. He thought that even if the early takes were imperfect, they would have a sense of spontaneity to them that you wouldn't have if you keep doing take after take. The performances would become they would become studied and unnatural, and Borzage always going for naturalism in his acting, in the way he wanted his actors to perform. Now, I did a big long series. Well, it wasn't that long, maybe about 8 movies of Borzage's last year, and following along with this great book by Hervé Dumas, Frank Borzage, on Frank Borzage. It was written in French and translated in English. As far as I can tell, it's the only book written about Frank Borzage, who in the 1920s and the early 30s was considered one of the greatest directors in the world. By 1940, was virtually forgotten. It was the late 60s. Andrew Sarris's American Cinema book put him in the far side of paradise and had some great analysis of his auteur, sorry for the quotes, his auteur status. But he is certainly a director who, for me at least, even though it's 90-some years ago, his movies have a very timeless quality to them, and a sincerity to them that you very rarely find in movie makers. Okay, thanks a lot for everybody who listened. I really do appreciate it. Comments are welcome. Take care.